Joel and Ellie. The sentiment surrounding these names is nothing short of complex. When we are reminded of them, we can't help but think of love, hate, and everything else in between. They are the faces of an iconic franchise that has gifted us with two of the most emotionally challenging stories that the video game medium has to offer. Regardless of your opinion on either game, Naughty Dog has undeniably pushed the boundaries of what it means for an audience to connect with its characters. And unlike other forms of media following a similar subject matter where the zombies are at the forefront of every major conflict, The Last of Us is hyper-focused on the human condition. It tells a tale revolving around the relationship between two broken individuals striving to overcome their hardships in their darkest hours. Part 1 delves deep into the psyche of Joel Miller as he struggles with the loss of his daughter. In the beginning, he is all but devoid of any real form of human connection for the better part of 20 years, until he meets Ellie. He slowly learns how to love again, and when he becomes attached, he is eventually faced head-on with a decision that would ultimately haunt him for the rest of his life. Joel refuses to go through the pain of watching another daughter die and massacres the Fireflies, at the cost of a potential cure and whatever morality he had left. Part 2 is more or less a polar opposite, with Ellie's mental state becoming increasingly devastating as she deals with the loss of Joel. She puts herself on a path of revenge to try to make ends meet, but eventually learns that the cycle of violence is nothing but futile. In the end, she is able to let go in the face of extreme trauma, in turn forgiving Joel for everything he did. No matter which way you slice it, The Last of Us will always be a story about Joel and Ellie, even if they weren't always physically present. Truth be told, I absolutely loved both of these games. They were experiences that were unlike anything I had ever gone through in my entire life. Which begs the question, how will it all end? Well, if Part 1 was a story about love and Part 2 was a story about hate, I think Part 3 should be a story about redemption. Redemption for not only our main characters, but for the fans who couldn't resonate with Part 2. A chance to show that despite all its controversy and flaws, it was a story that absolutely needed to be told for this trilogy. The third installment has all the power to wrap up the story in a way that could truly solidify The Last of Us as one of the greatest franchises in gaming history. And as much as I'd love to see a prequel game following Joel and Tommy's past, I think Part 3 needs to be a sequel to its predecessor. Because whether you like it or not, our characters' journeys are far from over. There's still more story left to tell. The ending to Part 2 left a lot of room for speculation in terms of where everyone is, mentally and geographically. Perhaps the biggest question is, what happens to Ellie? The last we saw of her was when she returned to the empty ranch house at the very end of Part 2, where she once lived happily with Dina and JJ. At first, many figured that this was Ellie finally getting back to her family after the painstaking trek to Santa Barbara, only to succumb to the heartbreaking realization that they've moved out. But upon further inspection, we see that she is wearing Dina's bracelet at the house, something that was not so noticeably absent during her time in Santa Barbara. This leaves the audience to infer that sometime in between her encounter with Abby and her return to the house, there was a scene that we didn't see. The ideal scenario in this case would be that Ellie went back to Jackson and talked with, possibly even patched her relationship with Dina during this time. I think Part 3 opens with this scene, followed by a time jump of at least a few years. This would allow the game to start on a relatively positive note, while still hinting at the main theme of redemption. I could see Ellie now living a fairly bleak lifestyle somewhere on the outskirts of Jackson as a border guard of sorts, maintaining very few loose personal connections, feeling as though she isn't worthy or capable of love after everything she put others through. Even though she may not be haunted by her past anymore, she is emotionally scarred and feels incomplete as a person. She's still searching for her purpose. As the years have gone by, Ellie becomes discontent with her rudimentary way of living and wants to make a change. In turn, this story should revolve around Ellie finding herself again and finding that purpose she yearns for. A logical way to go about this would be for Ellie to seek out the Fireflies. After all, her symbol is a moth, a creature that deliberately looks for the light in darkness. But I don't think her journey would be for the purpose of producing a cure like many fans have speculated, and I believe this for a number of reasons. As far as we know, the only doctor that was capable of engineering a vaccine is dead. And even if by some miracle there happened to be another one, Ellie sacrificing herself for humanity would ultimately undermine everything that Joel did for her. So I don't think they would want to rehash that plotline. Instead, the Fireflies and Ellie's new purpose should involve uniting with other survivors to eventually form a chain of sanctuaries across the world in order to live in harmony and fully combat the infected. She wants to leave without a word, but she also realizes that she can't go on this journey all alone. After a great deal of confliction, she reaches out to Tommy for guidance, who at first wants nothing to do with her. Through many years of inner turmoil dealing with the loss of his brother, his separation with Maria, and his awareness that Ellie wouldn't kill Abby, all he's left with is his trauma and frustration. But Ellie tries her best to explain to him that this journey will be for the greater good, and it will all be worth it if they could just set aside their differences for the time being. Even though he might not be the man he once was, Tommy is in much better physical shape than the last time we saw him in Part 2, and is still capable of dealing with smaller amounts of enemies and infected. So he reluctantly agrees, and the two set out for the Fireflies. However, this isn't the Ellie and Tommy that we've seen from the past. They're shells of their former selves who can barely look at each other. Their relationship at the start will harken back to Joel and Ellie's relationship at the start of Part 1, as the two must relearn how to connect with one another, showing how much they need people at their lowest. During their adventure, they would encounter their usual amount of infected and raiders passing by the area, nothing that they can't handle. But they would soon come across stragglers of a new unknown enemy faction. Piece by piece, Ellie and Tommy gain more intel on these people as they run into more and more trails. Little do they know, this would be the most heinous faction that they have come to see out of all their years living in the post-apocalyptic world. Similar to the Rattlers, this detestable group of opportunistic raiders will stop at nothing from gaining complete control of anything and everything they please, enslaving, torturing, and persecuting any outsiders that dare step foot near their camp, all led by one man, who goes by the name of the General. More on them later. Through a treacherous journey with our duo slowly connecting again, Act 1 will end with Ellie and Tommy reaching the Fireflies. Evidenced by the new game screen after Part 2's ending, this would lead Ellie and Tommy to eventually cross paths with a familiar face, Abby Anderson. Now, hear me out. Depending on who you ask, Abby is either a tragically morally compromised victim of Joel's actions or a complete psychopath who deserved to die. There really is no middle ground with this character. I am very much on the side of the former, but Part 3 could change the opinion of those who felt the latter. Because much like Ellie, Abby's story is far from over, so I think it would be a massive mistake if she wasn't included in the final chapter. In my eyes, the creators wouldn't have had Ellie let her go if she wasn't to play a vital role in the next game. There's simply too much potential for Abby and Lev to return as redeeming characters. However, this is where things can get dicey if not executed properly. One thing The Last of Us has done such an amazing job at is highlighting the importance of moral ambiguity in its characters. We saw it with Joel in Part 1, and we absolutely saw it with Ellie and Abby in Part 2. To this day, fans of the franchise can still hold a genuine debate about whether or not any of these characters can be deemed as good after everything they've done. One might imagine that Part 3 would follow suit and stick to the gray and gray trope, so as to not undermine this moral ambiguity that the audience has digested for the better part of a decade. But to that, I'll pose this question. If this story is truly one about redemption through and through, then would it damage the collective narrative if our characters were all to finally be seen as the good guys? To be honest, I don't think it would, because their past actions will always be their past actions. People change. Even if Ellie and Abby end up doing something truly heroic, they can still remain morally ambiguous based on their past. Regardless, a heated reunion between them should definitely be in the cards. When they first cross paths, Tommy is overcome with rage and blinded by hatred and attempts to kill Abby as Ellie tries desperately to defuse the situation. Even though she is conflicted at the first sight of her since their confrontation in Santa Barbara, she opts to try to make peace for the time being. After a while, they all settle down as Ellie explains that she was searching for the Fireflies in order to put things right, and they've gone through hell to get there, informing them about this new faction they keep running into. As it turns out, the Fireflies have come to blows with them as well, and there have already been casualties on both sides. For the first time, Ellie and Abby now have a common enemy, and they opt to set their differences aside and fight together for the greater good. Obviously, it would take a while for Ellie, Abby, and Tommy to fully trust each other, but throughout the course of the story they'll have each other's backs. Through countless dangerous runs together, they slowly gain each other's trust, which eventually culminates in a scene that I believe should absolutely be included in this story without question. One night beside a dying fire, Abby tells Ellie and Tommy the full truth about her revenge on Joel. As far as they know, she only went after Joel because she was a Firefly and he stopped a potential cure for mankind. But what they still don't know is that he killed her father in the process. It's a scene that was notably absent in Part 2, as Ellie nor Tommy ever learned her true motivation for her actions. Including this scene would give them a whole new perspective on the cycle of violence, and would act as a monumental step towards true forgiveness and redemption, especially for Tommy, who has held onto his hatred for such a painstakingly long time. With this new information, they begin to really trust each other, and agree that Jackson should act as another base of operations for the Fireflies as a way to pool their resources together and strengthen their numbers. Many skirmishes ensue as they trek back to Jackson to prepare for one final confrontation, made as a declaration of war by the general himself. As the final act begins, Ellie, Abby, Tommy, Lev, and the rest of the people of Jackson prepare for war, a historical event that will go down as the Battle of Jackson, Wyoming. As the general leads his army straight to the front gates, here is where the greatest action set piece in the franchise would play out, topping the war between the Wolves and the Seraphites in the previous game. Chaos immediately ensues as bullets, grenades, and Molotovs fly through the air. The player now has the option to cycle through our 4 characters and take out the enemy faction in the most effective way possible, whether it be with Ellie's traditional style of combat, Abby's brute force, Tommy's marksman abilities, or Lev's devastating stealth. The battle would last for an extended period of time, and towards the end, an event would trigger. Switching back to Ellie, we would see Dina and JJ get trapped in a burning building needing to be saved. In a test of sheer will, Ellie gets them both out while simultaneously fighting off multiple enemies. However, to our dismay, JJ's ankle has been severely injured as a result of being crushed by rubble, so Ellie must carry him to safety. And here, we'll see a familiar scene play out. Ellie runs like her life depends on it with JJ in her arms as the pandemonium continues. People are dropping like flies, buildings are set ablaze, and it seems as though all hope is lost. As Ellie gives it her all and struggles to carry JJ to refuge, she is met face to face with none other than the General. A short dialogue ensues. The tension is at an all-time high. He slowly raises his gun on them, and it's as if time has stood still, harkening back to the intro of Part 1 with Joel and Sarah, the very beginning of The Last of Us and the event that started it all. And at that moment, the sound of a gunshot can be heard, and the General drops to the floor instantaneously. As the camera pans over, our savior is revealed. Who else to deliver the kill shot but Abby Anderson? In turn, our beloved story has come full circle and gives an even greater meaning to Ellie breaking the cycle of violence. This time, we get a cycle of saving. She has undoubtedly returned the favor of letting her go on the Rattler Beach. And if this doesn't get fans who still hated Abby to finally get on board with her, then I don't know what will. As the dust settles the next day, we see the aftermath of Jackson. The town is battle-scarred and some citizens were killed, more were gravely injured. They may have technically won the battle, but it's up to the player to decide whether or not it feels like a win. One thing for certain is that the enemy faction has all been taken care of, and the Fireflies can continue to expand and create more safe places across the US to become stronger than ever before. Ellie and Tommy decide to stay home in Jackson to help rebuild and assist anyone in need. Before Abby departs for her home base, they share one last exchange. With tears in her eyes, she apologizes for killing Joel, and pleads that Ellie and Tommy could find it in her heart to forgive her. This is a state of vulnerability in Abby that we've never seen before. They take a moment to ponder what they just heard, and Ellie explains to her that she isn't sure she could ever fully forgive her, but she is grateful for Abby for saving her life and appreciative of everything she has done since they met again. Overcome with complex emotion, Tommy struggles to find the words, and decides to shake her hand as his way of saying thank you for saving Ellie's life. As Abby leaves on horseback with Lev, Ellie once again watches in the distance, but this time with a hint of satisfaction, even hope for the future. This may be the last time they ever see each other, and we should be okay with that, because even given their past, they were still able to reach out and help one another. In the midst of the aftermath, Ellie decides to visit Joel's grave one final time. We are reminded of all the good times they shared together through a sequence of short flashbacks as Tommy walks up behind her. She expresses her dissatisfaction with how her life has gone up to this point, but for the first time ever, she feels hope for the future. Tommy reassures her about the past and says this: "You may not have been able to save the world, kiddo, but you sure as hell meant the world to Joel." These simple words are all she needed to hear, as the two embrace standing upon Joel's grave, and it's as if he's watching down on them, smiling. Ellie and Tommy's arc is complete, as the two have learned how to love again. Before they leave, Ellie says one final goodbye and leaves Joel's watch on his grave. The camera slowly pans onto the watch, and for the first time in over 30 years, it begins to tick again, symbolizing that maybe, just maybe, things can go back to the way they were once long ago. Cut to black. The rest I would leave up to Neil Druckmann and everyone over at Naughty Dog, because I am not a screenwriter, and I doubt that I would be able to produce a narrative with the level of cohesion that we've seen from the past two games. Obviously, there's a lot of room for potentially grappling material to cover, as well as many new combat encounters. But in all honesty, something like my story probably won't even happen. However, it was still a fun prediction to make to try to highlight what the main themes might be about. There are a million different ways to subvert expectations, but sometimes a predictable ending works best as long as it feels earned. One thing I know for certain is that if this story is one about redemption, then it would give a great insight into the creative thought process that went into Part 2 and why it made sense from a narrative perspective. With that, it has the potential to go down as one of the most prolific and talked about franchises in gaming history. And while there is beauty in tragedy, I think The Last of Us needs a happy ending, or at the very least, a bittersweet one. Our characters have gone through unimaginable pain throughout their journeys, and they deserve some form of retribution. If anything, they deserve to be the good guys.